Friends, hello and welcome to In the Movement. My name is Sam Heath and I'm with Equal Justice USA. So we're a national nonprofit that does work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and helping people think about and engage in community safety. So we talk about working at the intersection of public health, of racial equity, and really helping people to think about what does it look like to respond to harm in a trauma-informed way. So In the Movement is a webinar series that we do that we've been doing for a couple years now. And our goal with it is to engage people in the movement, meaning just broadly the justice movement. And we want to engage and elevate other people's work. And so we've talked with really incredible people over the past couple years. We do this about every month. And so we're going to be talking today about some really specific things to a state, and yet things that also apply all across the nation, because there are patterns there of things that relate to the death penalty. So in this space, we talk about mass incarceration, and it's good to know about that term, that it's really important, and we believe that that's a thing, but we really look at mass incarceration more so as a symptom of something else rather than the main thing. And it seems like in our culture, mass incarceration, which is true, we'll give all the stats, and I love giving the statistics and the history of all of that, but underneath what we're doing and how we respond as a culture to harm seems to be a really fear-based response. So a lot of you in our audience, not everybody, but a lot of you are Christians, and within the Christian church, we talk a lot about the most repeated command in the Bible, which is do not fear. And it's something that the angel says to Mary, and that we hear people saying over and over in Scripture. And there's a really sad irony there that so much of our nation is built off of a fear-based response. And perhaps the place that it's best to see that, or easiest to see that, is within our criminal legal system. We've othered others and moved them and confined and removed them from society largely based out of fear. And so we want to acknowledge that and talk about that and name that and think through, what does that mean and what does that reveal about us? And how can we respond to harm, not with further harm or fear, but with a posture of healing? And as we tell my kids, and we get really excited when we hear books or movies say this because it's rare, that true courage doesn't necessarily mean not being afraid, but it means doing that hard thing anyway, even maybe while you're afraid. So we're not talking about removing all the scary things, but moving into difficult spaces and doing that hard thing. And it begins with things like this, a conversation and growing and knowing things. So we're going to look today specifically at the death penalty. We're going to talk about the death penalty and the history and the story of Alabama. We'll talk about an upcoming execution. So we'll kind of narrow in and zoom in on all of these things. But all of this relates to just this symptom of our criminal legal system coming out of a fear that we all seem to have. So I'm really excited to talk with my friend and colleague, Dr. Katie Owens-Murphy. She's going to be sharing a lot about some of the really unique work that she's done over the past several years. She's in a position to be able to see and affect and accompany a lot of unique things and people within Alabama. So Katie, thank you for coming. If you want to tell us a bit about who you are, and we'll jump into things that we want to talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Sam. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you to everybody who came. My name is Katie Owens-Murphy. I'm an associate professor of English at University of North Alabama. Kind of fell into this work backward through work that I started doing at prisons when I was in graduate school, and started witnessing extreme sentencing there, and then kind of fell backward into restorative justice work and prison literature, and started doing more research and topics like mass incarceration. And then when I moved to Alabama in 2015 to take this job, realized how active the death penalty was in the state, and so got more involved with issues of capital punishment. I also serve on the advisory board for Project Hope to Abolish the Death Penalty. I'm
I
wearing my
just noticed
flag
your shirt
today.
right when you said it.
Yeah, and I've served on their advisory board since 2017. They're an incredible organization that I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. And then finally, I'm also state coordinator for the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, which I know we'll talk about further, and finishing a master's degree with the International Institute for Restorative Practices.
Okay. Thanks, Katie. Well, for everybody listening, just so you know, as always, we record these, so we'll send out a recording of it to you all, both a podcast episode and a video on YouTube. We'll also, any group or link or website that we mention or that we put in the chat, we'll make sure to capture all of that. And if you're here, it means you registered, and I'll email you after all of those links so that you have those resources. There's a particular one that Katie and I are really excited to share with you that we collaborated on. So we'll make sure that you get all of those resources, all of those links. So you just need to engage and sit and listen. And I see some of you did this in the chat, and that's great. If people want to put in their name and where they are, and if they're with a group, that'd be great. It's always great to hear where people are. And where people are coming and engaging all of this. So a couple statistics just to frame what we're talking about, some big broad things, and then we'll narrow in, we'll zoom in to Alabama, and we'll kind of kickstart the discussion, Katie, after I say these things about what's happening next Thursday and why this is a really poignant moment in Alabama's history. So just so people have a framework for this, there's 2,300 people on death row within this country. And since our country's beginning, we've executed about 16,000 or so people. And there have been 195 exonerations in the modern era of the death penalty. And so that's really since 1976 when the Supreme Court brought the death penalty back. So put another way, it's about 195 people that we could have executed that were legally innocent. And those are just the ones that we know about. 23 states plus DC have repealed the death penalty here within the country. And last year in 2023, there were 24 executions. And just for a frame of reference, that's down from a high in 1999 when there were 98. Last year, there was a really important statistic that came out, or a study that came out that revealed that more Americans, for the first time now, believe that the death penalty is administered unfairly than fairly. Yet there's still a lot of public support for it. And so there's an irony there of we know it seems that the death penalty is not administered in this fair way, and yet we're still behind it. A part of that is I want to believe a lack of imagination of people not knowing about alternatives. Katie, you talked about restorative justice. We'll talk about that too. So one other thing that struck me, and I hadn't seen this until maybe the last couple of years, is that people who were executed last year spent an average of 23 years within prison. So when we're talking about someone receiving justice, if it's the death penalty, if someone's defining that as justice, it's not swift at all. So within Alabama, I believe the number on death row right now is 167 people. Alabama has had 9 exonerations. There were 2 people who were executed last year, Jimmy Barber and Casey McWhorter. And within Alabama, one unique thing about how they do the death penalty is that they ask those who are going to be executed to choose between, right now, the 2 options, I believe, of lethal injection or electrocution. So, and the last thing I'll note, and I kept thinking of events as I thought through this, and you all know this, right? Especially coming off of MLK Day, Alabama has a long civil rights history. I mean, think about the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, the letter from Birmingham jail, the Selma March, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, the Scottsboro Boys trial. And Katie, you said this. I don't know if you know that I know this group, but a shout out to the Selma Center for Nonviolence. I know of their work, and I'm about to meet with them and learn more about it. But that's another group on the ground right now doing some incredible things. So Alabama has a lot of history, a lot of it incredible and glorious, a lot of it bloody and tragic, and things in a way are coming to a head kind of with what's happening next week. And so, Katie, maybe let's start there. Next Thursday, there's something that's happening that's kind of same old, and there's part of it that's really unique here. I keep using that word because there are a lot of things about Alabama that really are that. So what's going on next Thursday, and how does that relate to you and your work?
Yeah, Thursday is the date that has been set for Kenny Smith's execution, and Abe Bonowitz, who's here, just put in the chat a link to a petition.
Thank you, Abe.
For those who are interested in signing, there's also going to be a petition delivery event January 23rd at 11 at Montgomery. But Kenny Smith, the state attempted to execute him a little more than a year ago through lethal injection. Hours he spent being poked and prodded with needles before the death warrant expired at midnight. And now they've set another date for him for nitrogen. They call it nitrogen hypoxia, but as my friend Joel Zivit likes to point out, that's not a real thing. It's suffocation through nitrogen gas. And so a couple of reasons why that's close to me and the work that Project Hope to Abolish the Death Penalty does. Number one, Kenny is from Florence, Alabama, which is where I live, and his artwork actually appears in the front of our book, in the frontispiece here. This is called My View of the World, and he created it in 2003 and donated it to the archive that we'll talk about later. I appreciate all the media attention that this is garnering, because it is an unusual execution method. It's going to be the first. It's untested. The Veterinary Society does not use it to euthanize animals. The UN just came out with a statement condemning its use and warning that it will be in violation of international treaties. But I would also like to read from you. The literature professor in me wants to read to you from one of my favorite books on this topic by Austin Surratt called Gruesome Spectacles, about the history of botched executions and why why the conversation about methods, while important, can sometimes be a distraction from the larger issue of abolition. So I want to read to you from his book. Newspapers also assume the legibility of pain and their capacity to represent it accurately. Although at times botched executions have occasioned challenges to particular execution methods, throughout the course of the 20th century, they've contributed little to the effort to end capital punishment itself. The question is why this has been the case. Part of the answer lies in cultural reception. The failure of newspapers to heighten the abolitionist potential of botched executions is a recurrent trend in their coverage throughout the 20th century. Newspaper accounts have served as a source of cultural reinforcement for capital punishment in the face of the brutality which botched executions expose. So, the attention to executions that fail or are botched really depend on the public sentiment, whether or not what's happening inside a person's body can be expressed, which we know with midazolam that gets suppressed, right? It can't always be expressed what's happening to the body. Again, my friend Joel Zivit has done great work on the impact that executions have on the body through lethal injection, through autopsies. When we see the lungs following an autopsy, we see that they're twice as heavy as they should be, which indicates pulmonary edema, or the sense that somebody is drowning, though they cannot always express that. And just one more passage here. Botched executions are failures that demand explanation and justification. In the past, newspaper accounts have helped maintain America's death penalty by repairing the damage done, by simultaneously telling two different stories about the execution scene, by subduing the violence entirely through objective reporting, and by impartially presenting readers with an undecided, perhaps undecidable debate. Newspapers have read and construed botched executions as unavoidable misfortunes rather than as symptoms of injustice crying out for rectification. Recuperation has meant identifying scapegoats, strange circumstances, and even alternative methods of execution when all else fails. Newspapers have not offered readers a deeper witnessing of the execution scene and in turn of capital punishment itself. So while I appreciate that the situation next week, that's scheduled for next week, is garnering international media attention, I lament that we're still in this sort of phase in terms of media and newspaper reporting of objectivity. And I really appreciate the op-eds that I've seen come out over the last few weeks where folks have really taken an opinionated stance, but I wish that weren't relegated to op-ed sections. And I think that sometimes we miss opportunities when we focus too much on the methods. We lose the forest from the trees and don't focus on abolition as a whole, which ought to be the goal.
Often I hear people talk about that the death penalty system is broken or not functioning. And then I also hear people push back against that and say, there's not a way that it can function well, that it's not that it's broken, it's that the whole system needs to be completely removed.
That's
I
right.
think it was 2022 that the Death Penalty Information Center called that the year of botched executions. And I know in Alabama that there were 3 of those, Kenny's being one of those. And this situation led Governor Ivey to halt executions. Obviously, they resumed those with Jimmy Barber. I believe it was July 21st of last year when his was. But Joe James's execution, I think, was the longest botched lethal injection in U.S. history at 3 hours that it took them to set an IV line. So this is something it seems a recurring theme in Alabama, that idea of a botched execution.
Yeah. And again, like I think the reporting around botched and failed executions, while important, also misses that opportunity to ask why it is that we execute. And so again, I think it can sometimes be a distraction from the larger goal of abolition and the larger question about why we're so intent on executing and why states like Alabama put so many resources into trying to execute folks like Kenny more than once.
Yeah. There's been a lot of effort around in that conversation of wanting to call for at least a halt to executions. I know last February, I'll put this in the chat and send it out in the email as well, but there was a letter from faith leaders that was sent to Governor Ivey that was asking for an independent review of the death penalty process that was there because in response to those botched and failed executions that had happened before. So people were recognizing there seems to be something inherent within the system that needs to be seen and unearthed, and it's calling the whole thing into question. And then sadly and ironically, then Alabama comes out with new protocols for nitrogen hypoxia that were heavily redacted with this untested, unregulated, unknown execution method that is likely going to happen next Thursday. But again, like we had with the petition that was there are still efforts around this to oppose it, to call attention to it. But that conversation of the whole thing is often kind of that elephant in the room of questioning, why do we feel this need to execute at all?
Yeah.
So you talked about the group Project Hope. So can you go into a little detail now, or a lot of detail, because it's really special, this group and how they began, and often how kind of the first thing often that people say with this group that makes it a really special group, and we'll point people to some of their work.
Yeah, happy to. And I know Esther is on here. Hi, Esther. Project Hope to Abolish the Death Penalty is the only 501c3 nonprofit founded and run by people on death row in the nation. Esther Brown is the executive director. She's on the outside, but their entire board of directors is on the inside. They do have an advisory board, which I'm proud to serve on, of folks on the outside who help with various projects, but it's all inside led. They do advocacy, they do special projects, they do archival work, which we've helped them to collect in our Alabama Death Row archive. And they do it all from Holman on death row. And so I first came into contact with this group through Gary Drinkard, who's a death row exoneree, 93rd death row exoneree, invited him to campus to come in and give a talk. And he told me about this amazing organization, put me in touch with them. And he had been a member of the organization when he was on death row for a crime that he did not commit. But the amazing thing about Gary is he remains committed to the organization, is still involved with them even today, decades later. So it really showed me what self-advocacy can look like. And I just try to do what I can on the outside to help elevate what it is that they're already doing. So happy to talk more about the book or the archive and their work, but they've been doing this since 1989. So I'm new on the scene. They're the OGs have been doing this for a
Yeah.
very, very long time. And as I say in the book, one of the most incredible things is their longevity, because by design, the leadership is picked off one by one. I mean, they are executed. That is why they're there. And so it's amazing to have gone through their archive of newsletters to see how they managed to maintain organizational integrity and continuity, despite the fact that they are all dying, being resentenced. They're all like leaving in one way or another, but the organization itself somehow remains intact and remains this incredible vehicle for abolitionist change. So I just think they're amazing. Can't say enough about them.
Can you talk about the Wings of Hope newsletter and
Yeah, so
what that
that's
is
one
and
of the
how that's
first
put
things.
together and the difficulty it takes to do that there?
That was one of the first things I came across, and that was the motivation for the book, was to put together these newsletters and tell more of a kind of story of their organization of the death penalty in Alabama. So from a donated typewriter that breaks down pretty regularly, from what I understand, they type a newsletter that goes out quarterly. They send it out to Esther, literally cut and paste and arrange it on the inside, send it out to Esther, who then photocopies and digitizes it, and then it's put on their website for distribution and sent to a mailing list. So they have both a hard copy mailing list, and it also goes on the website. But I mean, they stay informed about policy changes. That's the way that they inform each other about policy changes. One of their mantras is you're only as good as your lawyer. And so the idea is that they have to really stay up to date on their own cases and on Alabama policy, which has been changing quite frequently in the death penalty, in order to be best advocate for themselves. And so the newsletters provide updates about policy, what they're working on. They work on campaigns. They've been working on, moratorium campaign for decades. Um, they have creative writing. That was what struck
Mhm.
me, especially as a literature person, was the beauty of the poetry and their opinion pieces, which were so insightful. And reading some of the prose poems, I was really, they have some visual art too in the newsletter. So I was really captured by the creative displays too of their resistance. And that was a main feature of the book, especially the poetry. I found that to be incredibly powerful.
I put the link in the chat for Project Hope, and if people want to get on that email list and see some of those older newsletters, but also receive the new ones, you can sign up for the email list there, and those are really incredible. You talked about policy, and then let's talk about the book. One policy that I wanted to highlight that's important within Alabama is that I want to make sure people know is that up until 2017, a judge could override the sentence of a jury when they had voted for someone to receive life in prison, meaning a judge could come in and say, no, I think that this person needs to be executed, and then they could override that. Until 2017, that's something that was allowed. And I believe there's at least a couple dozen individuals who are still on death row that applies to. That's no longer legal, but that law is not retroactive. So it doesn't affect those people who were already there. So that judicial override discussion is still there. I know one piece of hopeful legislation is that override piece will be retroactive, but that came up in the book when I read through it. Like, that was one thing that is discussed. It directly affects them. They know about this, and these are their lives that they're talking about as they talk about these different policies.
Yeah, in fact, Kenny is one of those people. A jury voted 11-1 to sentence him to life, and it was overridden by a judge. So, I mean,
Yeah,
among the many ironies of Kenny's situation is that he would not be there today,
yeah.
where his trial held today, rather than when it was held. So, the fact that that law was finally changed, and I believe Alabama was the last state to finally get rid of judicial override as a practice, but was not made retroactive. You still have I believe, yes, Esther said in the chat 30 at least. I knew it was over a dozen, 30 at
Thanks,
least
Esther.
people
Mhm.
currently on death row based on an old policy that's no longer legal.
Yeah. Now, though, the judicial override, I believe, can only happen if 10 of the 12 jurors recommend death. So I think that that's the case, but it's not retroactive. So yeah, 30 individuals that this applies to.
Mhm.
So Katie, you referenced a couple times, and I think you might have flashed up a second ago, but the book, so Ghosts Over the Boiler, Voices from Alabama's Death Row, captures so much. I have mine here because I want people to see the cover of this, and we'll talk about it. So you served as the editor for this, but this came out of you and Project Hope's work and what these men are doing there. And I say men too, with a nod to later in the discussion, we'll talk about that there are women on death row in Alabama, and we'll make sure to honor and reference and talk about them for a bit. But this is specifically talking about the men and their work. So talk a bit about this book and how it came to be.
Yeah, well, when I found the newsletters and saw what an incredible story they told, I approached the organization and asked them if anybody had ever approached them to do a book, for a broader audience. They have the newsletters posted on their website, but you only can see the newsletters if you already know about the website. I wanted them to have a broader reach. Part of their mission is to educate the public about the death penalty. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could find a university press, to sponsor the publication of a book that could help them to reach a broader audience? And so we spent years putting together a proposal, selecting pieces. At the same time, Esther started sending me some of their earlier newsletters that had not been archived online, some of the older hard copies. Their articles of incorporation, as a nonprofit, old photographs of some of the original founding members. And we needed a place to store all that incredible material. Much of that found its way into the book too, but we also needed a place to store it, which is how the Alabama Death Row Archive came to be. We founded an archive at the University Library in order to physically store the material as we were putting the book together. But I tried to select pieces that really spoke to the policy and practice of capital punishment and how it was changing and evolving over time. Thank you, Sam, for putting the link in the chat there to the archive. And tried to also intersperse it with as much visual, rhetoric as we could. So photographs and some of their visual art. Some folks on the inside are incredible artists. We wanted to feature their art as well. I also wound up doing an interview with the folks who are currently on the board of directors. And so that kind of framed the piece. And then I also interviewed Gary at the end, and had the group write a final essay to kind of close out the book. So we did add some pieces to kind of shape and bookend the book. We also divided it into sections. My editor wanted it to be broken up a little more, and so divided it into sections to make it a little more coherent and user-friendly. And all the subtitles for those sections are taken in vivo from quotations from the newsletter. So really wanted to center their work, their voices as much as possible. And I'm really proud of how it turned out. And the folks at Project Hope are really proud of how it turned out too, which is what matters most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a book that's almost exclusively primary sources in the sense that it's these men speaking and the things that they've written, the poems, the art that they've done, some of it photos of things that they've even written from the inside. You and I talked a lot about this book, and I know one theme that we really discussed more was that idea of resiliency. How
Mhm.
how did you see that as you worked with these men and the works that they produced over these years?
I mean, it was emotional putting the book together. I can't
Mhm.
fathom what it is like to be one of the members of this organization. Somebody was asking in the chat what the name of the book is, by the way. It's called Ghost Over the Boiler, and it's titled after a poem by Daryl Grayson, who is one of the writers who's featured in the book. And I'm thinking specifically of Daryl, actually. One of the main features of the newsletter is called Letter from the Editor's Desk. And
Mhm.
it's where the editor of the newsletter gives kind of an update about what's happening with the organization, what's happening in the state. And that is also where editors kind of sign off. So as they receive execution dates, that's where they make their final statement in the newsletter, hand off the baton to the whoever is going to take over. And I can remember, you know, particularly poignant passage from Daryl saying, you know, my date has been set. What else is there? What more is there to say? And the next letter is somebody taking over his seat from the editor's desk. So the resilience in terms of the motivation to keep going
Mhm.
after watching and witnessing so many of their friends go around the corner, as they put it, be executed, and the fact
Mhm.
that they're still motivated to continue the work, continue the organization, and continue the legacy of the founding members, I think is the one of the most poignant examples of resiliency that I've ever witnessed. The fact that they're also still working today, even with all of the mounting, legislation and changes in methods that are piling up, with all the failures in the Supreme Court and the failures of the courts to protect them in this moment, they are still advocating and not giving up. And there's actually we ended the book with a beautiful poem from Daryl Grayson about hope that I would love to read, if you don't
Mm.
mind.
Mhm.
Sam, it's called
Please.
Thorns of Hope, which really, I think, captures the spirit of resilience. Thorns of Hope. Hope is in bloom, its fearsome thorns coming soon. Hope crisscrosses the mind, its thorny arms come swinging, leaving its essence behind. Hope tends its every need, its blood is drawn and spilled from years beyond the till. Hope, that bush of thorns, the nature of our fears, nurtures numerous arms from the sum of our tears.
Mm. And that idea of hope crops up all across the book. I mean, again, the name of the organization is Project Hope to abolish the death penalty. The newsletter is Wings of Hope, meaning for the individuals in a situation like that, that hope is what they have. That hope, that desire, that's the tangible thing for them. So it's difficult in talking about botched executions, exonerations, kind of some of these exceptional things, while amidst a whole abolition discussion, right? The group is Project Hope to abolish or completely end the death penalty. But within Alabama, it has a really layered history, even up through recent days. I mean, again, if we just talk about things in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, there's so much that's there. But we referenced those non-exonerations earlier, and I want to name a few of those because some of these are individuals that one, that you know, Katie, but also that are still out and doing things in the world and have moved up kind of onto the national stage. And so Anthony Ray Hinton is one individual, and he wrote the book The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row. Another individual is named Randall Paget, and I'll put in the chat and in the email. There was a short documentary that Witness to Innocence helped put together about him and his story and what happened with him. And he was a man of faith, and he talks about and shares some of those things within that story. Walter McMillan is another individual. He, in his case, was talked about a good bit in the book and the film Just Mercy about Brian Stevenson of Equal Justice Initiative. And then you talked about Gary Drinkard. So just to elevate and honor him a bit, can you say a little bit more about him and his story and your interaction with him?
Yeah. So uh, Gary's incredible. I mean, Gary, as he mentions in his retelling of his narrative in this book, I mean, was picked up for marijuana and wound up with a charge of death. Was found himself on death row. What's amazing to me about Gary is I believe he spent 5 years on Alabama's death row, but he has spent more than 20, in the abolition movement since then. So if you just think of that in terms of proportion, to me, it's Gary's dedication to this cause, despite the fact that he himself was innocent, and also knowing that he was on death row with folks who weren't.
Mm,
So
mm,
I guess in the same vein that sometimes I think the conversation takes a left turn when we talk about botched or failed executions as if there could be proper execution. Sometimes I get a little frustrated with conversations about innocence as if we could just get it right, and
mhm,
then
mhm,
executions would be sound. Gary understands, based on his lived experience, that there is no distinction between, for him, as he puts it, between those who are innocent or not guilty and those who are guilty. Nobody deserves execution. Nobody deserves those sorts of conditions. And so I really appreciate how he has dedicated himself to the movement. He is a member of Witness to Innocence. That's how we wound up coming in contact with him. Witness to Innocence is also a directly impacted group led by former exonerees. And so they do speaking engagements. If any of you want them to come to your college campus or church or, whatever your community organization is, they're a great organization. They, pay their speakers to come in and tell their stories and facilitate discussions about the death penalty. And so that's how I met Gary, through his work with Witness to Innocence. He continues to support Project Hope to abolish the death penalty. He continues to travel. I think he was just in Rome, talking to some folks about the death penalty in Alabama. And so I just admire, speaking of resilience, Gary's resilience to keep fighting for this issue that no longer necessarily directly impacts him. He's one of those folks who, even after he kind of makes it out, still reaches back behind him and tries to do what he can for those who are still there. And he's very close to Kenny in particular. So we've been having a lot of conversations lately about what we could do for Kenny in particular.
mm. I want to remind people listening, and I might not have said this earlier, that if people have questions, we're going to make sure to save some time at the end for those. You can put them in the chat at any point, or you can put them in the Q&A feature, and we'll come back to those in a little bit at the end. Katie, we mentioned before that there are women on death row in Alabama, and they're housed at a different facility. I think it's further southwest at Tutwiler, and it's 5 women who are there, which I think is our nation's third largest female death row. So can you talk a little bit about that and what we know? I mean, there's some different things about how the women are arranged there, and activity amongst them is different, and there's a lot of engagement and a lot of chance for help with the men in the ways they engage each other, but not quite so at Tutwiler. So what's going on there, and can you say a word about the women?
Yeah, in some ways, Project Hope to abolish the death penalty, the organization, has provided a kind of container through which the men at Holman can organize. They can meet. I think they meet. Esther might need to correct me in the chat, but I think they meet twice a week. They come out of their cells to meet twice a week in a group setting. And so, because their organization has such a history and is recognized, they're able to get out of that isolation a little bit more, and they're able to organize with each other. From what I understand about the women who are on death row at Tutwiler, there are 5 and they're not housed together. There are 3 who are housed together, 2 who are housed together, and they're separated by a big expanse of space. So they're not even allowed to really, kind of coordinate with each other, communicate with each other. They are quite isolated. Sunny Jacobs has actually talked about this from her time on death row. She's another death row exoneree from Florida, but she has talked about how women in particular tend to be very isolated because there are so few of them.
Mm.
And so they tend to be ignored. They're not able to obviously access any kind of programming, organize with each other. And so, I mean, she was actually part of a lawsuit to try to get herself more access to programming based on her own isolation. I think she was isolated even in a men's prison.
Mm.
So, because the numbers are small, women on death row tend to be ignored both physically, but also in terms of academic scholarship. And I'm not, I'm guilty of this as well, is because women make up such a small number of people on death row, there's a lot of focus on men and not as much focus on women in terms of overall scholarship and statistics. So there's still a lot of work to be done about the experience of women and how that's unique. And
Yeah.
as you and I know, correspondence and communication is difficult. The women on Alabama's death row have very good attorneys, which I'm happy about,
Mm-hmm.
which means
Mm-hmm.
they don't want, correspondence interfering with any potential appeals. And so the ways in which we can support and assist them is limited as well, which is why I'm grateful to the group that you helped to organize, the People of Faith Alabama Death Penalty Coalition, because we were able to provide at least some care packages for them around the
Mm-hmm.
holidays. But the ways in which we can also support them seems to be limited.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well put. Well, I saw Esther that you had asked if you could say something. I'm going to click the allow you to talk button, Esther, and you can unmute. And you're welcome to come on or off camera. But yeah, I wanted if you meant it was something immediate now, and either way, please feel free to go ahead.
Okay, I don't know how to come onto the camera, but I just wanted to say a little bit more about Project Hope to abolish the death penalty. Um, it is unique, and at the beginning, uh, the founders, one of them happened to be a friend of mine, um, made an agreement which we have never broken, which is that we would not talk about conditions. We would simply focus on the death penalty. Also, I do have to say that people come and go, and it is not always because they're executed. Um, since I've been there, which is now 24 years, um, two of the chairmen were executed. I've worked with six. So um, people come and go. But what the wonderful thing is that it's people who are part of it have meaning in their lives. And when I first came, I made them read Man's Search for Meaning. A man who was in a concentration camp, Viktor Frankl. We can't do without meaning. And they do have a weekly meeting, that is correct. And actually today was a meeting, and I told them I'd be going on Zoom. And what they're doing at this point is that they, at the end of their meeting, they read 3 articles from the book, and they are making their way through the book. And the wonderful thing is that they're finding that it's always relevant to their situation. Um, but of course, it's not easy. I can't say anything about it. The organization bought a typewriter, then we had to buy one also for the other part of prison. That is how it went. We've made offers and so on. Well, it's prison. Or as Derek Grayson would say, this is prison, darling, So we do the best we can.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we put things in through a spiritual advisor, but it's a problem, but that's how it goes. At the same time, I do believe that the Department of Correction sees our organization as something positive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that none of the guys ever get into trouble, and if those trouble is drugs, we have them in every prison in the whole country. But we do have standards. For example, they have to attend They have to write an article for the quarterly newsletter. We have rules. You know, it isn't just, you know, a free-for-all. We also have parties. We have a party at Christmas. We have a party, I guess, I don't know, I guess Easter's coming up. We had one for Thanksgiving. But I do have to say that as times like these are very difficult for all of us. Just very, very difficult. And yes, the death penalty is wrong. And I completely agree with you, Katie. Yes, some people are innocent. There Grayson was innocent. I investigated his case. And we couldn't get the stuff tested that I found. And yes, your attorney is as good as you make him. Okay. So that's why they're kept up to date. I send them in articles that I'm mailing almost every day, you know, so that they are up to date, that they can read them, go over them, share them, and so on. And of course, I talk to them on a daily basis. So yeah, they know what it's about.
Thank you, Esther, both for sharing that and for your work. Excuse me, I'm glad you're here. Thank you. So, Katie, another aspect of your work I know is this recently funded, right, art installation project.
Yes.
So what is that and the timeline for it? And then I want to ask about the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program. We'll see if we can get to the RJ work. And then there's some questions, and we'll close by looking at the discussion guide. But what is this art installation project?
Yes, so the Alabama Death Penalty Archive, Death Row Archive rather, was a collection of documents started by mailings from Esther and Project Hope to Abolish the Death Penalty. But we also wanted a way to bring it to life because it lives on this like online database that mostly researchers dig into, and it just, you know, wasn't translating into a public interface. And so I started a relationship with some artists, good friend of mine in Kerrigan Casey, and she recruited some other artists, Kiana Brewster, Al Key, a friend of ours named Nadine Moress, and we're all putting together a traveling art installation that will be a collaboration between these outside artists and also artists on the inside on Alabama's death row to bring some of the material from the death penalty archive to life. And actually, one of the pieces is behind me here. Let me see if I can bring it on screen. This is a diorama of a death row cell sent to us from home in prison, created from cardboard, tinfoil, paint. It's really incredible, the detail that's on here. I'm sure this picture is not doing it justice, but on the back here is also a scale. It was created to scale. 1 inch equals 1 foot. So one thing that we're going to be doing with this piece in the exhibit is creating a scale model of the space, the dimensions of a cell, so that folks can get a sense of what that space is actually like for the people who are in it. And we also printed out a larger copy of Kenny's piece, My View of the World, which, as you can see, there's a reflective element here because you can see yourself in that food tray there. And we've also printed it out to scale. So we really want to give folks a sense of perspective and scale, and really ask folks to like literally step inside what this experience is like for the people who are living in it. And so we did get some money, some grant money in order for it to travel from the Alabama State Council of the Arts, and from the National Performance Network. The first showing will be in Selma, Alabama in May at Arts Revive for the month of May. Second showing will be in June at the Tennessee Valley Museum of Art. And we are looking at locations for July and August. So we'll keep you up to date on that.
Okay, great. That's great news, that especially about the dates and where it's going to be. Okay. Well, some other work that you do is the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program. Can you talk about what that is and how long you've been engaging that?
Yeah, so that is a program that started at Temple University in Philadelphia. Now it's a national and even international program. It basically pairs together universities and prisons so that we take students from a traditional college campus, bring them out to a prison setting, and they have class with incarcerated students. So the on-campus students are the outside students, the incarcerated students are the inside students, and everybody's mixed up together. And it's a very kind of restorative justice setup where we do circle work, a lot of collaborative small group work, creative projects. And I brought the program to Alabama in 2018. It had not extended to Alabama at the time when I came here. We started offering classes at Limestone Correctional Facility, which is the largest men's prison in the state. And it went so well that we wound up expanding the program into a 2-year, 6-course restorative justice certificate program that now is also 4 credit for the inside students. So after 2 years, students can earn a certificate in restorative justice that is credit-bearing, interdisciplinary coursework from English, criminal justice, psychology, and sociology. And so it prepares them to do some change-making work in the world, which is exciting.
Wow. Wow. Someone, and this might be a good time to mention it, had asked in the chat of, do you do work outside of the state and share your knowledge other than the book, obviously being something that people can get anywhere, but are you in other places and spaces sharing about these things in this work?
Totally. I mean, so the Inside Network is a national, international network, but also I work with a great group called the Southern Collective for Higher Education in Prison. And so that is a network of higher ed and prison organizations throughout the South. And we all have Zoom calls like this where we get together and strategize and workshop ideas and work on best practices. And then I'm also networked with a number of amazing restorative justice organizations. I know we were going to talk about those, but I just wanted to give a few shout outs because I know some folks are here, like Ashley from the Rafah Institute, RAPHAH Rafah. They work in Nashville. Ashley and Travis, they do incredible work. They've been out to our facility a couple times to do trainings with our Inside Out program. Also Selma Center for Nonviolence, Nikisha Tilton's incredible talking piece, Eric Butler and Eric Butler out of Austin, Texas, I believe they're based. And then we also have some folks who we work with who are not in the South, but who travel quite a ways to come and see us. And so our folks, Friends Collective Justice, based in Seattle, Washington, they've been out to do a training at our facility as well. So we're very lucky to be in lots of great networks with other incredible organizers and folks doing incredible work.
And you touched on this last thing I want to ask about, some of the important work of restorative justice work in the South, but also some of the difficulty of it. And just we've done some webinars on restorative justice before, but just real quick for people, can you say what you mean when you say restorative justice, and then what does that work look like?
Yeah, so it's the opposite of capital punishment. Is I guess the best way I could encapsulate it for this particular session. Actually, I know Danielle Surratt's coming on next, so I just wanted to read a brief passage from hers that maybe sets this up. She says this, and by this she means violence intervention work rather than perpetuating violence. This will include eliminating the most severe penalty available, capital punishment. We can do this because of a moral approbation of state-sponsored killing, because of concern about the practical and financial drain it places on the system throughout the necessary appellate process, because of its inefficiency as a deterrent of any kind, or because we've been persuaded of the imperfection of the criminal justice system and know that anytime we have the death penalty, we will inevitably execute some people who are innocent. For whatever reasons, we reject the use of capital punishment. A criminal justice system that opposes violence cannot have killing as its maximum penalty and still achieve its aims. So, currently we kill people to tell people that killing people is wrong, which is incoherent. Restorative justice moves away from retribution toward community repair. So it's about relationship building. It's about community building. It's about identifying needs, identifying the root causes of harm and crime and why it occurs, and doing our best to put things in a place that meet those needs so that that harm does not keep occurring. So it's about repairing and restoring rather than taking more things out of the equation.
I mean, in some ways, when we talk about these things, whether it's restorative justice or issues with the death penalty, so much of it seems really clear. And yet a lot of people really cling to that, to capital punishment. And that was one person's question in the chat of, have you felt some consistent themes of why people in Alabama especially continue to hold to the death penalty, despite knowing all the things that we've covered today?
Yeah, I think there's a real spirit of retribution and corporal punishment that stems from some of the things you talked about when we kicked off the webinar. All of those, the systems that made the civil rights movement necessary don't just go away, right? And that power structure doesn't just go away. And in fact, as some folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates have pointed out, they become worse in places where there's Black advancement. There's often white lash, and so we find this retrenchment happening, and we see it happening too with the redistricting, in terms of the voting districts debate that's happening in Alabama right now. And so I think that part of the problem is you have certain positions, attorney generals, DAs, which are elected positions in the South, and the ways in which people continue to run and to gain popular support is based on tough on crime policies. I think too, you have district attorneys and prosecutors, attorneys general, sometimes also convincing people who are who have received harm that their only option for healing and justice is retribution, is extreme sentencing. And if you talk to folks who are recipients of harm, and it's decades in the rearview mirror, it's hard to see extreme sentencing and even capital punishment as really having been effective for them. And in fact, there's a great book about victims' last statements last statements for folks who are being executed in Texas that shows that victims do not feel that sense of relief that they were seeking when they're witnessing executions. So I think that you have a lot of these structures in place that are really difficult to change, and restorative justice requires a shift in power away from those authorities like district attorneys and judges toward communities. You're really taking a vertical structure and trying to make it more horizontal so that communities are responsible for their own solutions and for working through harm themselves. And that can be a tough shift when you're used to working within vertical systems of power. And of course, those who benefit in those vertical systems sometimes resist that shift. So, I mean, there's a lot in the mix to reinforce it, but those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. Yeah, thank you. The last thing I want to talk about and go over before telling people how they can keep up with you and your work some more is we talked about this discussion guide. So you and I talked before the holidays about what would it look like to build out a discussion guide, especially for churches, based off of this book so that communities can have some of these conversations, but have those driven by those individuals and by those men who have produced these works. So I want to put in the chat a link to this, and I'm going to share my screen for a second so we can talk about this, Katie, and some of what you and I had put together. So the hope was to take this book and this work and to have a conversation guide for churches, something that could be done, especially within small groups, so that people could really faithfully reflect on this. And one thing we talked about was this is not assuming people are really at any place on the death penalty spectrum other than being willing to consider it or faithfully reflect on it. People might be all the way to abolitionists, completely supportive of it, or somewhere in between, but this is meant to highlight some things and have people think through it. So it talks about the book, talks about Project Hope, points to the Death Penalty Information Center's year-end report, EJI, and some other things to give a frame for this. But people can go through the book and read it all at once, or if they want to focus on some themes. I've just had a couple of these, and then Katie, you had added some really good ones, like holidays on death row, something that I think that we don't often think about, specifically the devaluation of life. And then it gives the page numbers of if people want to dive into a specific theme. And then it just has discussion questions for people to think about certain things that individuals have said. It links to some organizations doing some of the work. There's one section here where there's just quotes from the men and things that they're saying for people to think about and reflect on. There's some verses there, if this is specifically a Christian church, that people can look at and hold up what the Bible is saying up against what we see with the death penalty. And then I really like question 9, because with your work in restorative justice, Katie, you're not just saying, let's stop the death penalty, but you're talking about that next thing of what we want to point people to. And so this section here points towards restorative justice, violence interruption, other community-based violence prevention solutions, so people can think the death penalty is not there, then what are we doing to address harm? Then it gives just a bunch of resources to other individuals who've done some great work. So this is meant to be something that's out there, that's free, that's adaptable and usable for people to be able to engage. Katie, what would you want to add to that or say as we kind of premiere this with people in the world?
Yeah, I think that's great, Sam. You've done great work on this too. I appreciate it so much. And it is for folks who, aren't necessarily going to sit down and read the book from beginning to end, although I hope that you do. But it provides ways for you to navigate the book in terms of theme and topic, and you can kind of jump around in order to kind of cluster the readings based on some thematic studies. And I just want to highlight something Esther said earlier, which is what was really important for me in putting together the book was to show moments of joy too, in addition to the moments of despair. I think this group is they're a group of very funny people as well. They have senses of humor in the darkest times and places. They do celebrate holidays together. They form community on death row. They characterize their relationships with each other as family, being like family. And I think that really comes through in some of the holiday pieces, for example. But I really wanted the work to show that kind of balance too, that it's a very difficult topic, but it also shows just some amazing glimpses into, again, to use your word from earlier, resilience and community building as well.
Great. Well, Katie, how can people keep up with you and your work? Like, what would you want to point people to so that they can continue to follow a lot of these threads of things that you're doing?
Yeah, so definitely go to phadp.org and follow Project Hope to Abolish the Death Penalties. Get on their newsletter, their mailing list, and follow their action items. Because in addition to cataloging what's happening, they also do a lot of advocacy. So when there is an execution date set, as there is next week for Kenny Smith, they will have a list of actions and talking points for you to follow. So definitely get on their mailing list and follow what they are doing. In terms of the Restorative Justice Lab at UNA, which kind of houses a lot of our programming, including the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, we do have a website. And so, Sam, I can send that to you and you can send it out in the project notes. For folks who are interested in that website, our group also has a newsletter. The Inside students create a newsletter about their experiences with restorative justice, which is really cool. So that's a way to get a glimpse into what they're experiencing in the program. And then the Alabama Death Row Archive is where we archive a lot of Project Hope to Abolish the Death Penalties materials, and also just any other materials that come our way that are relevant to executions. We've had journalists donate their execution eyewitness notes, including my friend Lee Hedgepeth. He's donated a lot of his materials. We have, again, creative art. A lot of our art from the art installation project will wind up there. So that would be another good way to keep up, would be to check out the online archive.
Okay, great. And for folks listening, I'll have all of those links in a follow-up email that I'll send out to you all. Okay. Well, as we wrap up, Katie, you already gave a nod towards this, and I'll put this in the chat too. So next month, Danielle Surratt is going to come and talk about her book, Until We Reckon, which is an incredible book about mass incarceration and violence and a road to repair, which I think is the subtitle, which is why it's in my head. And Danielle Surratt is the founder and executive director of Common Justice, which is a group that's based in Brooklyn that engages violent offenses for individuals and thinks about restorative justice solutions to those to divert them from the criminal legal system. Again, that word unique, a really unique group in their work and really important and deep work. So Danielle's going to come and talk about that work and her book and some of the ways that she speaks about and does these things in the world. And really looking forward to that. And also so people know that that's paired up with CCDA, or the Christian Community Development Association, a national group. Each year they have an LIS, or Locked in Solidarity Week, where they emphasize mass incarceration, and that event is in partnership with them. So really excited to talk with Danielle. And again, kind of like we did, Katie, let's remove and end the death penalty and talk about then what do we add into it, always holding both of those pieces together. So next month is really going to complement a lot of things that you talked about here. So Katie, thank you for coming today, which is great, but also for your work over these years, being so consistent with it, for really centering the individuals who are affected by this and their stories, and just walking with you over this last half year, being able to see the genuine way that you do this work has been really encouraging. So thank you for all that you've done. For those that are listening, we'll make sure to point all these resources to you, especially some of the petitions. Keep Kenny Smith in mind next week as he approaches his execution date. But again, Katie, thank you so much for coming on here. I appreciate it very much.
I appreciate you having me. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thanks to everybody who came. Blessings on everyone's day, and we'll be in touch soon with some of those resources. Thank you all, and bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.